Well, hello, fellow YouTubers. Today we're going to take a look at a Atwater Kent Model 60C. This is the chassis and the speaker for the 60C. The 60C is a highboy console radio, and the 60C chassis uses a field coil speaker, and that's what you see here is a field coil speaker for this thing. I just finished going through this for a customer. Wasn't a complete and total restoration, but it was a refurbishment of the electronics in order to make them work well. And while I did that, I left the original pieces in place so that I did not destroy any of the historical significance of the radio. So what you'll see here is if I were to, well, these covers are tough to get off, but you'll see I did not restuff these cans. I'd like to leave that stuff in place because that's the only way you can tell what the original stuff looked like. Well, I think I'll just have to leave it by telling you that I didn't restuff them. So they are original inside, so if anybody ever goes back into this radio and wants to know exactly how the original components were put together, well, they're visible inside this radio. Now, I believe that this radio originally came with globe tubes, but they're pretty spendy. So when the customer brought this radio to me, it had some very good condition ST style tubes, so they're put back in place. And we basically went through and did a refurbishment. Tried to keep as many of the original wires as I could and that were safe, but any wires that were brittle and cracking, breaking, and so forth, I replaced with some nice cloth covered wire. It's the reproduction stuff, and it doesn't look exactly like what came on the radio originally, but then we don't need to burn our house down either with a bad wire. And they're nice looking radios. They're fun radios to use, and it is a TRF set, a tuned radio frequency set. So there's no automatic volume control or anything like that. It's a really simple circuit in terms of radio design. Now, the way Atwater Kent put things together is kind of like working on a French car. Atwater Kent did things their own way, and so you have to kind of get used to the way they do things. Their resistors look different, their capacitors and their wire wound resistors all look different than other radios. But they're not too bad. The thing about radios from this vintage is, even though the circuits are simple, the materials that the radios were made with and the way they were set up in the radio itself physically is often quite fragile. So when a person works on a radio like this, a person often has to take more time than they would, say, on a 30s console radio like that airline sitting over there. Instead, a person has to spend more time making sure not to damage the original components or not to damage the materials that the radio is made of, because usually these late 20s radios and very early 30s radios are getting pretty fragile by this time in their life. So I did that. Here's an example. I wanted to keep the original speaker cable as much as I could without causing any major changes to it. Well, if I could have replaced it with a new wire harness, and that would have worked just as well. These wires, the wires themselves are fine, but the insulation and so forth, the outer cloth covering, not really the insulation, but the outer cloth covering was beginning to fray. So I kind of have a quandary. Do I remove the original stuff and take away from the historical significance, but yet make the radio more safe? Or do I leave that in place and risk, perhaps there is high voltage going to this speaker, perhaps, the customer getting a shock or maybe having some other sorts of problems. So what I opted to do was to cover it with a clear insulation, a shrink wrap, a shrink tubing. And then, you can always remove that insulation and still have that shrink tubing and still have the original material underneath. So I don't believe I removed any historical significance from the radio. Everyone has their own philosophy on how these things are done, and that's mine. So let's give this thing a whirl. Let's turn it on, shall we, and see how it plays. Really simple, nothing to it. And although you can't really see the dial light does come on. And nothing to it. Let's give her a tune here. Now, when you're tuning an old TRF radio, you have to be aware that some stations, the strong ones, are going to come in quite loudly, and the weak ones are going to be a lot less audible.
And ultimately he did, posthumously, as just this
There's an example of a weaker station.
Pastors and ministers and leaders.
Much weaker than that original station.
Perspective about nutrition and about integrative medicine. But also the value.
See, there's a station that's practically right next door. That station is just a couple of miles from my house.
Learn how to lead.
There is a sensitivity control on this station, on this radio, and you would turn that sensitivity control, and it reduces the noise and any distortion that might come from the strong station overwhelming the circuitry. Of course, you know, the sensitivity control also reduces the receptivity of the radio, so that when you're tuning in weaker stations, they're harder to get in. Quite a loud radio when it's played full blast. So that was with the sensitivity control on. Yes. So quite loud when the sensitivity control is turned off on a strong station. What we have in terms of a tube lineup are a couple of 45s for outputs. Here we have some. The RF tubes are a series of 3 27s. These are 27As. these are 24As. And then here are some 27s right here. So 24As, 3 of them, 1, 2, 3. A couple of 27s, a couple of 45s, and then an 80 rectifier. Really simple radio. They look really nice when they're put together. I will be putting this in the cabinet and finishing off with another piece of the video here in just a few minutes. This is the Atwater Kent field coil speaker. It's a heavy thing, very large field coil. And there you see what the model number looks like on it. It's a model F4 or type F4 speaker. And I had to source this one for the speaker. When they brought the radio, they originally had the an older magnetic speaker, which wasn't right for this radio. And here you see the back side of it. They're quite attractive, especially when they're mounted in their cabinets. They're nice radios to look at. All right, I'll pause the video, and when I get the radio all put together, I'll finish her up.